if you've only been in the business a short period of time, it's fair to take the position that the people who were saying that were idiots, because look what happened, right? But if you pull back a little bit and you say, okay, well, what happened in 2016 in some markets was really, New York was crazy in 16 and 17. But if you think that's going to happen again in 2025, nobody knows what's going to happen. But I say that, I like to compare real estate to poker. Poker is not gambling. There is chance, but it's probabilities. If you know how to play poker, it's all about probabilities.
Your network is your net worth. Come listen to some of the most successful people I know share invaluable knowledge, stories, and advice in real estate, business, and beyond. This is Weiss Advice. Whether you want to take your business or personal life to the next level, look no further. Welcome back to another episode of Weiss Advice. I am your host, as always, Yona Weiss, here on this beautiful day. Excited to be here with Kevin Clark. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, Kevin. How are you doing today?
Good, Jonah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
The pleasure is mine. It's amazing. I mentioned to you earlier, you were recently on another podcast, the Investor Mindset podcast with Patrick. Yep. And it was just incredible to hear so much of your story, so much of the background, what you've been through. We met last month at an event in New York, and I'm just grateful that we can bring the Twitter world to the Weiss Advice podcast, which is a really phenomenally new thing because I'm relatively new to the retweet and the Twitter world. But you're one of the old assets of Twitter, as I understand.
Yeah, I've taken it more seriously probably over the last 18 months or so. I used to be sort of a reply guy and just, didn't really see how it would fit into a business model. But I think a few folks have really shown us what can, how Twitter can really be leveraged in a way that, makes a lot of sense for us in the real estate world, which we consider it a sort of an IRL business in real life. But the Twitter retweet has certainly shown that, there's a lot of opportunity if you take it seriously and you think through what you're saying and how you're coming across, which it took me a little while to learn that one, I think. Not
Absolutely.
Sure I've picked it up 100% yet, but I'm trying.
Everything's a learning process. But, I think that in real life, a lot of the online, especially Twitter, it's a catalyst for kind of creating those relationships and warming them up. Whereas, instead of just cold outreach and things like that, case in point, we met at an event with a very, kind of intimate event, about 15, 16 people in New York. And here we are, having a podcast and getting together. It's just amazing.
And it's incredible too. You have people like Eli who got us together, but Moses and Strip Mall Trent and a few others who are really sort of the network, and you for sure, networking catalysts almost. They're sort of the people that bring everybody together, and that's actually new. Retweet's been around for a little while, a few years, but I think only in the last, Reconvene maybe was the jump. I didn't go to the first one, and I hope to go at some point. I'm not going this year, but yeah, that sort of getting offline and into the real world, sort of bringing it full circle I think is really, really great. And I think there's also, Moses, I don't know if you had a chance to watch Chris Powers' interview with him and his partner on their new business that they're working on, but that's just showing sort of the power of leveraging the network that's created mostly from Twitter to then launch this sort of, GPLP business that looks really exciting. And I think Nick Huber's doing it another way, not necessarily real estate related, although that's sort of his background, but, definitely leveraging Twitter in a way that I think certainly I didn't think was possible until recently, for sure.
Yeah. And just to give our listeners a little more context, you've been in the commercial real estate world for the better part of 20 years. On the brokerage side, as well as investment side, you are also a professor, which is pretty cool. I don't think we've had too many professors on the show teaching real estate and economics at NYU. So tell me a little bit about that, because I'm curious to know, is it a daily, a weekly, is it a regular or kind of adjunct professor position?
Yeah. So I went back in late 20s, early 30s, got into real estate, had a mentor who recommended, because I was doing something else and didn't have a lot of real estate experience, recommended I take the NYU real estate program, which is a master's program in real estate finance and development. And so I did that, and then I did fairly well. And one of my professors, or actually two of my professors, asked me to teach relatively quickly after I graduated. And just, I do it once a week pretty much year round. There's 3 semesters, 2 in spring, fall, and summer. And it's 1 day a week, but it's graduate students. It's real estate economics and market analysis. And I've been doing that for about 15 years. Probably will pull back from that at some point, maybe teaching on my own. But yeah, it's a wonderful learning experience for me. I mean, I think you probably know this and others understand that you learn far more teaching than you ever learn being taught.
Sure.
You have to really understand a subject to explain it. And it's been very helpful for me.
What I'm really curious about, and I'm sure you've heard some of this backlash, which is you don't, in real estate especially, you learn a lot more from experience than necessarily from the classroom. Yep. So what is it that, kind of the tools that you give students that allow them to kind of grow in the classroom, that they may not be getting from the experiential part of it? Because you need both. There is a benefit to both sides of it, but I'm wondering, what it is that you're teaching there. That's great.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the degree program that NYU has is a graduate program. So it's more kind of like an MBA in real estate. Mm-hmm. I think the best way to say it is, first of all, it's very expensive. So when, it's a lot more expensive even when I graduated, which was in 2005, but it's not a cheap degree. So you could look at it and say, is it the right way to spend money? But I do think that it accelerates, especially if you're doing a certain type of real estate. If you're looking at institutional real estate, if you're looking at sort of private equity investing, certainly development, if you want to do development that's more than just like a 3-family and sort of getting your feet wet and moving, sort of learning all your mistakes and that kind of stuff. If you're looking at it more on the institutional side, which is sort of bigger dollar amounts, it accelerates your learning process. So I would argue it's a way to try to, rather than learning something over 10 years, you learn it over a few years in the classroom, and then you're applying those experiences. And the other thing is, a story that I tell when I got into brokerage, my first job out of grad school was on the pension advisory side, and we invested money for pension funds. And then I moved into brokerage, and I distinctly remember sitting with a partner of the firm with, essentially a billionaire who was a real estate, developer and owner operator in New York. And we had been hired to evaluate several properties they had and then market them. And, we're sitting at the table, and I'm having, as the junior associate newly hired on the team, I was the only one on the team who could have a high level discussion with this person about the sort of on the fly discussion about NOI and do we include certain properties and how does that affect value, and why would we want to include things and not others, and sort of upside. And not that the other senior broker didn't have that experience, but he didn't have the comfort level, in my opinion, to have a conversation on the fly. He was like, oh, let's table that and let's talk later. And so it's that sort of, how do you say this, sort of comfort level with your own knowledge to be able to sit there and say, I'm not bullshitting you. I'm not making stuff up. We're having, I may not be right. We can disagree, but at least we're having a high level discussion that's fact-based rather than emotion-based. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And unfortunately, you come across very often junior brokers who don't have that real experience, who are just kind of BSing things and making things up. And unfortunately, fake it till you make it. And unfortunately, it may come back to bite them when they're, caught in their own lies or their own misconceptions of things.
Yeah. And I would even say that if you followed me a lot for very long on Twitter, I was the guy 18 months ago who was saying, look, this is where we are in the cycle is, we're peaking. How long it's going to last, we don't know, but this is irrational. And this is people are going to get left when the music stops. And a lot of people on Twitter who've made a lot of money in real estate in the last 5 years, were pretty insulting to me and saying things like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You're sitting on the sidelines. And, not that I'm, tooting my own horn, but the thing is if, one of the things a degree helps you contextualize is it's, yes, I've been doing this 20 years, so that helps, but it's also just looking historically at interest rates and learning and understanding what monetary policy is and fiscal policies and how they affect real estate investment. So doesn't mean I know when we were going to peak, but I certainly understood that 3 caps were the top. That could have been another 5 years of 3 caps, but we're not going to 2s.
Yeah, it's hard to get any further than that. I mean, it just doesn't make sense financially for things to, for values to increase anymore.
And you know it
At
as
that
an
rate.
investor, if at a 3 cap, you don't have a lot of room to,
Yeah.
one or two tenants don't pay on time and you're essentially behind the 8 ball on expenses. So, and that's what 3 caps mean. It means executing perfectly, and nothing is ever executed perfectly in real estate ever.
Absolutely. Now, do you actually keep in touch with any of your students over the years and see them and kind of getting into the real estate world? It sounds like this program would be geared to, as you described, people who are going into private equity or going into institutional levels or working
Yep.
for REITs and things like that. Is that very common?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I do keep in touch with students who keep in touch with me.
Right.
It's not an outreach thing that I
Of
do
course.
for a couple of reasons. One, the program is a 2-year full-time program. Many students are part-time. So I have them, the classes that I teach are considered core classes. So they're early in the program. So they may not, by the time they graduate, they haven't seen me in 2 or 3 years. But I do frequently meet with students about, career choices and what path they want to go, reaching out to me for, for interviews or recommendations, that kind of stuff. But yeah, the path typically for this program is institutional, but that doesn't mean, I mean, every year we'll have students that are, even, mid-career or, I just had a student or a Wall Street guy who was essentially my age, had made a ton of money on Wall Street, retired, decided he was bored and said, I don't want to, I want to put my money to work and I want to know what I'm doing and I want to learn. And and we get students like that a lot, doctors, right. People who are beyond that. So yeah.
Makes sense. I mean, real estate for a lot of people is a hobby, and
sure,
doing it on the side when they have another job.
An expensive hobby if you're not doing it well.
Well, that's true. I mean, so are many hobbies, to be honest.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But it's, a hobby that could potentially make you a lot of money as well.
For sure.
I mean, what's your main focus? I mean, if you're doing teaching 1 day a week, obviously that's not your full-time gig. Is it in the brokerage side? Are you still pretty active in the commercial brokerage in New York? And what does that look like on a day-to-day?
Yeah, commercial brokerage. I learned it on the working exclusively on the sell side. But as I've sort of matured in my career, I've learned that I'm pretty good at very complicated deals and sort of like 1031 exchange, advisory, that kind of stuff. Difficult tenant lease negotiations. Things that have a little bit of hair on them typically are things that I'm good at, but also just straight up, selling, 6 families, 12 families, 24 families, and mixed use. I mean, Brooklyn and Manhattan is sort of our focus. So anything that you think about there, we don't get a ton of development sites. That's not really our thing, but I've certainly sold them in the past. But yeah, it's pretty much standard bread and butter, New York commercial brokerage.
And is it, I mean, obviously you talked a little bit about the downturn in the markets. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing that like play out in real time right now?
Yeah. So New York, we had, if you remember 18, 19, interest rates started going back up. At that point, we were 11 or so, 12 years into an upcycle, and we were starting to correct. Rents had peaked. We were seeing a significant softening in the market at that point. And then we had in 2019, we had a pretty significant rent law change in our rent stabilization market, which is about 50% of the market in New York. Of the total number of units are either rent stabilized or rent controlled. So we had some pretty significant hits in the market just prior to 2020. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, COVID comes in. New York got hit pretty hard. We did not see the accelerating in pricing the way other places did, primarily because people fled New York and went to the Sunbelt states where they saw the big rent bumps. But we saw a lot of softening and vacancy and non-payment of rent. And that's sort of working its way through. And I think we're starting to pick up. I think historically, New York and LA tend to lead the market or lead the national market. So we're somewhere around 18 months ahead of the rest of the market typically. Mm-hmm. And I expect that to be the case again. I think that, we are starting to see some picking up. The one problem, of course, is the banking sector is a mess. I think that's more institutional than it is sub-institutional. But, capital's capital, right? And if you need to get money at a bank and their balance sheets are a mess, and that's what we saw in 2008 and 9 is, there was lots of money available and interest rates were attractive, but the balance sheets at the banks were a mess and they weren't typically lending super easily unless it was multifamily. Right. So I expect that to be a similar thing once we get there, but we're not there yet, but we are starting to see some real distress. So, and I've been waiting for that for a number of years. A lot of my clients, I mean, the great thing about the way I work is also a curse, right? Is I'm not afraid to tell you when something's a bad deal on the brokerage side. And the problem is we've had a lot of bad deals for a long time.
Right.
But now when the market gets more healthy and returns return, a lot of the investors that have been sitting on the sidelines are my clients. So, we'll be looking forward to that pickup.
And they're just waiting. They're just waiting to pounce.
Yeah, and trying to figure out legislatively. I mean, New York is a tough market. We have legislative risk in ways that not many other markets have. I think California has similar, although they're as draconian as California is, New York is proving to be far more draconian. So especially with the uncertainty, there's some changes coming that, hopefully are going to answer some questions, but they're actually tightening up some loopholes that are potentially problematic. But we'll see. The great thing is that creates opportunity, right? And that's the truth of the matter is if it's too easy, then that's where you get into trouble.
Yeah. If it's too easy, that means everyone else is going to be trying to do that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So what are some of those opportunities that you think, or you project, based on your experience, that you might be seeing coming down in the next, 6, 12 months?
If we're only going to exclusively talk about New York City, I think the rent stabilized market, I think, is really interesting right now. There's a lot, most of the money was in that up until this 2019 law change. A lot of money was in that sector because there was a lot of opportunity to increase the rent roll when you had lease turnover. And that opportunity closed. There are a number of things happened in 2019, but that was the major one, is that you no longer can, you're renting something for $1,000, market is 3,000. The tenant's been there for 25 years. They leave. You could raise the rent through investing in that asset up to market as long as you did certain things and followed certain rules. They eliminated that ability. Wow. So most of the private equity money has pulled out of that market. A lot of the opportunistic people have pulled out of that market. And because of, that shocking change in the market also created uncertainty from the investment standpoint, in the sense that, if they did that, which is devastating for this market and the owners of those assets, what are they willing to do next? And so a lot of people have pulled out of that market. And so, there's a lot of supply and not a ton of demand. So cap rates are starting to expand significantly in that market. And I think for the right type of business model, there's a real opportunity there, especially if you're not saddled with what we call legacy assets, assets that you bought, in 2018 at a 3 cap because you thought you could increase your rent roll 60%. Now you're stuck with a rent roll that's not going to increase. And we just saw the Kuwaiti sovereign wealth fund just bought a big institutional portfolio, at not an amazing cap rate, but not terrible. But I think at the sub-institutional level, we're going to see cap rates go a lot higher. And if that happens, I think that creates an opportunity if you can get some scale. That, because then the other thing there is if you follow that market historically, it's a pendulum, right? It swings towards the tenant, and then it swings towards the landlord, and then it swings towards the tenant. We've clearly swung towards the tenant to the detriment of the market. And I think the legislative branch is going to figure that out at some point, and they'll ease the rules. And anybody who's bought opportunistically is going to not only have great cap rate and great cash flow, but will also benefit from cap compression that will happen when those rules relax a little bit. That's the thesis, at least.
That makes sense, at least for New York. I mean, it's amazing to learn about how each market is so unique, and there are a lot of different rules, and you have to be a local expert in order to really understand it. And that's the advantage of having someone like yourself on your team as an advisor who can tell you all the history and know what opportunities are coming and when they're coming. Yeah.
I will say, I think outside of New York, I think we're in for a world of hurt. I think there's caps are going to return to, they're going to normalize, I think, in a lot of markets. And I think people aren't understanding that yet. There's a reason why cap rates in California and New York are lower than in Pennsylvania. And that reality, I think, is going to come crashing home, I think. But
just values are going to start going down.
They're just going to normalize. It's going to be 6 and 7 caps and not 4s and 5s in those markets, because low barriers to entry, problems with demand. When I think people start going back to work and work from home settles out a little bit, I think that might happen too. So
very interesting. Now, what about on the buy side or in the investment side of things? I know you're a broker and that, advisor, and that has a big part of your your portfolio, your day to day, but on the buy side, investment side, are you investing solely in New York, or do you invest out of New York as well?
Exclusively in New York. We don't do a lot. We haven't done a lot recently. A lot of things that we purchased years ago, we ended up selling at very favorable returns and then focused on brokerage and other things. But I think getting back into that market or this market is definitely the next step, because I think finally we've seen a long run up in values and cap compression that has finally shaken out. So in the process of figuring out the next step, hopefully we'll have some announcements on that at sometime soon.
Okay. We'll keep our ears open for that.
For sure.
Keep our Twitter open for that to see what's going on. I'm curious if you can give one piece of advice for, something like that you would normally tell your students for someone who's starting out in real estate that may not have a lot of experience, but is looking to get involved in the real estate world. What are some, one or a couple pieces of advice you would give?
Yeah, for the students, especially because I was a student in that program, I think the advice that I give is pretty applicable, even if you're not sort of formally studying real estate. And it's work hard, talk to people who have real knowledge, who aren't necessarily having a vested interest in an outcome that they need you to buy into, and talk to as many people as you can and really think about what they're telling you, and then do your own investigating, your own study, and confirm the information that you're getting. And I think the other thing is, don't be cynical. It's easy, in real estate, I like to say that you have to be somewhat optimistic to be in real estate because it's a future value investment, but you have to be suspicious of, there's a lot of charlatans and a lot of information. Everybody has a vested interest in you doing something for them, but it's easy to become cynical. And I think you got to fight from being cynical. You've got to, put the deal aside and work on the next one. People are going to take advantage. You're going to get burned a few times, but that doesn't mean everybody's bad. So, fight becoming cynical, but you got to say, trust but verify, right? But don't become cynical. So if it's possible.
That's really good advice. And it's really hard to do that, especially if you do get burned. Like, it's very easy to think that everyone in the real estate world is like this when you run into some of those shady characters.
Yep.
And unfortunately, it was my experience. I did some brokerage for about 18 months or so. I was pretty, heavily involved on the brokerage side of things. And I had probably met with, many, many owners and many operators, but more so many, many brokers. And probably over the course of that 18 months, I probably met about 100 other brokers and, dealt with whether one was on one side of the deal, I was on the other side, or just conversations. And from that time, I literally could count on one hand the number of brokers that I actually would trust and actually want to do a deal with. And that's unfortunate. It's a bad feeling to have when you're dealing with that. So it's hard not to be cynical, but you got to push through.
And people say things like, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. That's very true in real estate. And the problem with real estate also is you're making decisions today that you're not going to see the results of, even in the best scenario, for months. And so, if you're 2 years out from whatever somebody's telling you is going to happen for this to be successful, it's really easy to be taken advantage of. So that's, one of the things I say on Twitter and I talk to my students about. And that's one of the reasons why education is important, or experience, whatever way you get there. But it's like, the 3.5 cap investment, it can work out. And if you're doing it for the right reasons, and I talk about this a lot. 3.5 cap with real upside is fine. But the problem is, what do you have to do to get that upside? Right. And if you have to execute 100% and everything has to break your way, and you have to get certain other things to fall into line, but greed is a funny thing, and also track record. A lot of cap rate compression made a lot of people who made arguably marginal decisions look like they were geniuses, and that's okay. You got to be on the field to hit the home run. But if you're batting 100 going into the next one, it's going to be a painful thing because you're not going to get bailed out with cap rate compression. If anything, you're going to have to deal with cap expansion and debt issues, and that's not a lot of fun. It's funny, when I graduated, when I really got into real estate, it was 2006 and 7 essentially. And we saw the money getting shoveled out the door and everybody thinking they were smart. And then 2008 and 9, everybody looked like idiots.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my students, that's immediately when I started teaching, was when the market was starting to collapse. And what I said to the students is, you're going to get to see all the benefit of all the mistakes that everybody made, and they're not going to be your fault. And you're going to work through these issues and work through this stuff. It's invaluable. The problem, though, is who thought we were going to have a 12-year cycle, you know? And
right. Yeah. I mean, I remember all the way when I really got started in real estate, probably 2016 or so.
Mm-hmm. Right.
At that point, I was hearing people saying, the market is getting too high. We're going to hold our cash and wait for the next cycle. And here we are, 7, 8 years later.
And the funny thing but the funny thing about that is that if you've only been in the business a short period of time, it's fair to take the position that the people who were saying that were idiots, because look what happened. Right. But if you pull back a little bit and you say, okay, well, what happened in 2016 in some markets was really, New York was crazy in 16 and 17. And 18, 19, we started to see interest rates getting pushed up and rents had flattened and were dropping and the market had softened significantly. So if you were pulling back and if you started to get scared in 16, 17, you weren't wrong. You actually were right.
Mm-hmm.
But then a 100-year event happens with unprecedented fiscal and monetary policy where things literally black swan. Yes, of course, we've had pandemics before, but work from home and Zoom and all these things. Who could have predicted that we would have
the interest rates as low as they were and everything.
And so it broke in your favor. But if you think that's going to happen again in 2025, it might. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But I say that I like to compare real estate to poker. Poker is not gambling. There is chance, but it's probabilities. If you know how to play poker, it's all about probabilities. And if you play the probabilities and your opponents aren't, you're very likely going to win most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But you can always lose on the river card, right? Something pulls up and it's just like, hey, I did everything right. Cards just didn't go in my favor. Most of the time, though, you don't have to have the cards go in your favor because you are playing the probabilities. And that's really, I think, a good analogy for real estate. It's like, okay, I didn't buy in 16, 17. I might have missed out, but I wasn't wrong in what I knew at the time, right? You couldn't predict 2019 and 20. It's
Absolutely.
just impossible.
Absolutely. Kevin, I want to transition out of what we call the final four. These are four questions I have for all my guests. First question for you is, what's the worst job that you ever had?
Oh, wow. I've had a lot of bad jobs. I was a finishing carpenter actually in Nantucket for a while. And I thought I was going to be a lawyer and was a paralegal for a while and had a very good experience, but realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. We moved to Italy and then moved back. And when we moved back, we went to Nantucket because we had friends there and a place to stay. And I ended up working for a finishing carpenter there. And I thought it would be great because I like construction. I liked that real estate aspect of the business. And it was miserable. And for lots and lots of reasons, I learned a lot about carpentry, but it was not a job that I was particularly suited for, mostly because of the people. But that was probably the worst, I think. And I've been a dishwasher, I've cleaned house. I've been a janitor, in college. I've done a lot of things, but that was probably the worst.
Yeah, it sounds pretty bad, but you learn from every experience.
Yep, for sure.
Definitely do. What's a book you've read that's given you a paradigm shift?
That's a great one. So I also teach negotiation at NYU. And one of the books that I assigned, I read for the syllabus, essentially, which is Voss's book called Never Split the Difference.
Yeah.
Voss is a negotiator for the FBI. And I think wrote I haven't read every negotiation book, but most of the negotiation books are they start with this idea of win-win.
Mm-hmm.
And Voss sort of steps back and says, because the things that he learned to negotiate situation, right? Either people live or they die.
Right.
And I think that's pretty applicable to real estate because real estate is not a multiple year negotiation. Typically it's a one-off negotiation. You have one opportunity to negotiate. And so win-win is really not, you don't really have to worry about that as much because you're not going to get another chance to negotiate with these people. So I think Voss's book is excellent when it comes to thinking about emotion and thinking about how to communicate with somebody on the other side of the table where emotion is the driving thing 9 times out of 10.
Yeah.
And it's not about, the union next year we'll get back to them or whatever, which is where most negotiation books come from.
Very, very interesting. And I love that book. And we've had it brought on the show before, but he's just fascinating.
You had Voss on the show?
No, we haven't yet. We've had it mentioned on the show before. I've actually heard him on a cold podcast. I'd love to have him on the show, actually.
He's a funny guy. There's some great interviews out there with him online, and he's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
Great stories, good talker.
Well, I listened to the Audible version, which is him.
Yeah.
Speaking on it, which
don't expect great. His voice is different than you expect, right?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no, that's not true, because the first I heard of the book, I heard him on a podcast.
Oh, okay.
With Steve Pesavento, who's was on the show as well. And he did something on there that just blew me away, which was like 30 seconds or she dies. This exercise that he did with the podcast host. And he said, which side of the table do you want to be on? The negotiator or the terrorist?
I haven't heard that, but that's, I mean, it's a good one. I mean, his thing is, like, for instance, how do I get to your price?
Right.
Everybody and including myself, you want to negotiate. You're like, you're stupid. Yona, you're crazy. $6 million. This property isn't worth $2 million. F you, you're wasting my time. That's everybody's response. His response is, tell me how we get there. Tell me what we do. You walk me through this process. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to walk yourself out of that 6. You're going to acknowledge that and even if it's just acknowledging, hey, that's what I need to leave with a sale, then okay, then we're not going to get a deal done. You know, but it's not anchoring at 6. It's unrealistic at 6.
Absolutely. Yeah. So. Awesome. So third question, what's a skill or talent that you would like to learn?
That's a great question. And I would say probably coding. I think, and I've tried to learn, and I just think it's one of those things. It's like they say you can't learn a foreign language after your mid-20s, or it's very hard to, because your brain is the way it is. And I don't necessarily believe that. I think if I sat down in a room and really tried, I could probably figure it out. But I think in this world where, I mean, even if you look at like Chat GPT, and, there is some real coding required to really dig down deep into that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I wish I had more of that. And if I could learn that skill, or I could have the patience maybe to learn the skill, that's probably one I would go with for sure.
That sounds like a great one to learn. Definitely very useful nowadays. In many aspects. Finally, Kevin, what does success mean to you?
This is a great question. So I would say, I think this has changed for me. I'm 50. Okay. So, and I think 10 years ago, it would have been X amount of dollars, and, but I think now my kids are in their early teens, and my older daughter is probably going to be in college in 3 years or so. And I recognize now that spending time with them and the family is so invaluable, especially as my parents have gotten older. This morning, and all week, actually, my younger daughter's a pretty serious soccer player, and I wake up in the morning at 6 a.m, and go out and play soccer with her for an hour before school, and just teaching, because I played pretty competitively. And so I'm trying to help her get better, and seeing her joy, and when she learns to do something or solves a problem, and having the time and flexibility to do that is, I think, for me, success. That's not everybody gets an opportunity to be in that situation. And there are certainly costs to it, career costs potentially, and other things, but I don't think she's going to remember dad's X amount of dollars more than she'll remember, our time in the morning and my other daughter helping her learn to swim and those kinds of things.
100%. I totally agree with that. And it does change, the definition does change.
Yeah.
As we do get older, that's for sure. And seemingly the more important things actually, come out, and we mature on our own and realize what's most important to us.
For sure.
Finally, Kevin, where can our listeners find you or reach out to you if they want?
Best thing is Twitter. I think I've got a bunch of email accounts, but DMing on Twitter, follow me on Twitter at Cribdilla or at Cribdilla, which is CRIBDILLA, and DM me. My DMs are open. Answer any questions, and happy to exchange emails and phone numbers and jump on calls and that kind of stuff for sure.
Very cool. We'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. And it's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me once again.
For sure, Yona. I appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Okay. And to our listeners, thank you guys for listening all the way to the end. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly learned a lot and really enjoyed this conversation. So remember, until next time, the best advice comes only when you ask. Real quick, I have one question for you. Did you like this episode? if you did, I want to ask you a huge favor. See, the biggest thing that helps this podcast grow and that will spread this message to the whole world is that if you leave a review, a rating, and subscribe to the podcast. What that does is it basically tells the platforms that this podcast is out on is that you like my stuff and I'm doing something right. So take a few seconds out of your day, hit that subscribe button, leave a rating or review. I would be extremely grateful. Also, I want to hear from you guys. So I want to hear some feedback. If you have any questions for future episodes, please find me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM, a connection request, Yona Weiss, and I'd love to hear from you.